Have you ever wondered what people did before there were condoms, pills, IUDs, or even the basic idea of a sperm meeting an egg? Because ancient humans definitely did not look at pregnancy and say, well, I guess that's that. They had ways of trying to avoid it. Some were surprisingly clever. Some were basically wishful thinking. And at least one involved crocodile dung. The strange part is that contraception is not a modern invention. The desire to control when you have children is incredibly old. Long before pharmacies and clinics, people were already experimenting with plants, barriers, timing, withdrawal, breastfeeding, and rituals. But here's where it gets interesting. Ancient contraception wasn't one single trick. It was a giant collection of experiments, passed down through medicine, tradition, and sometimes pure desperation. And our best evidence comes from one place in particular: ancient Egypt. Around 1850 BC, Egyptian medical writers recorded recipes for preventing pregnancy in what is now called the Kahin papyrus. One prescription involved crocodile dung mixed with a paste-like substance. Another used honey and natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt. The ingredients were prepared as substances placed in or around the vagina. Yes, crocodile dung. But before we laugh at the ancient Egyptians, there is an important detail. They weren't necessarily thinking in complete nonsense. Some of these mixtures could have had physical or chemical effects, even if they were nowhere near as reliable as modern contraception. A thick, sticky substance could create a physical barrier. Certain acidic ingredients could interfere with sperm movement. Acacia gum, for example, appears in later Egyptian contraceptive recipes. When acacia gum ferments, it can produce lactic acid, and acidic environments can reduce sperm mobility. So buried inside some very strange ancient recipes was a basic idea that modern contraception still uses: either stop sperm from getting where it needs to go, or make it harder for sperm to survive. The Egyptians also used mixtures involving acacia, dates, honey, and plant material. One later papyrus describes a preparation applied to lint and inserted vaginally. Think of it as a very crude homemade contraceptive insert. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't standardized. And nobody was checking the dosage with a laboratory instrument. But the basic engineering problem was already understood. Sperm has to get somewhere. So, make the journey difficult. And then there was breastfeeding. This one sounds less dramatic, but it may actually have been one of the more naturally useful methods available to ancient families. Long periods of breastfeeding can delay the return of ovulation after childbirth, especially when nursing is frequent. In societies where children were breastfed for long periods, pregnancies could sometimes be spaced naturally. Ancient Egyptian sources also indicate prolonged breastfeeding as part of birth spacing practices. But here's the catch. It wasn't a guarantee. Your body doesn't read the rulebook. Ovulation can return before the first obvious period, which means someone could become pregnant while still breastfeeding. So ancient people had something that modern medicine would recognize as a fertility effect, but without the precision we have today. And then we get to ancient Greece and Rome. Here, the methods become even more creative. Ancient writers described withdrawal, timing intercourse around the menstrual cycle, and various substances that women were told to apply internally. Historical sources also describe behavioral methods, charms, and medicinal preparations intended to prevent pregnancy. Some physicians recommended oils, plant preparations, or mixtures intended to block conception. There was also silphium. Silphium was a plant associated with the ancient Mediterranean, especially the region around Cyrene in North Africa. Ancient sources connected it with contraception, although exactly how effective it was is difficult to establish. The plant became extremely valuable and eventually disappeared from the historical record. The famous story that contraception alone drove it extinct is much harder to prove than the basic fact that ancient sources associated the plant with fertility control. That has created a fascinating possibility. Imagine an ancient plant becoming so desirable that people basically use it into oblivion. But we have to be careful here. Just because ancient writers said something prevented pregnancy doesn't mean it actually worked. This is one of the biggest problems with studying ancient contraception. We have recipes. We have medical texts. We have traditions. But we don't have controlled clinical trials from 2,000 years ago. Nobody was randomly assigning 500 couples to silphium group and 500 to placebo group. So historians have to separate what people believed from what actually worked. And that distinction gets even more important when we talk about herbal medicines. Ancient medical traditions included plants and minerals that were believed to prevent pregnancy or end an existing pregnancy. Some substances may genuinely have affected fertility. Others were probably ineffective. Some could also be dangerously toxic. Historical scholarship generally finds that pharmacological methods in antiquity had very limited, reliable contraceptive impact compared with mechanical approaches. In other words, ancient contraception could sometimes blur into something much more dangerous, attempts to induce abortion. And that distinction matters. Preventing fertilization and ending an established pregnancy are not the same thing, even though ancient sources sometimes grouped them together. There were also behavioral methods. Withdrawal is probably one of the oldest imaginable contraceptive strategies because it requires no ingredients, no equipment, and no medical knowledge. It just requires timing and self-control, which, unfortunately, are both rather unreliable pieces of equipment. Ancient people also used forms of fertility timing, trying to identify periods when pregnancy was thought to be less likely. Again, the underlying idea wasn't completely absurd. Fertility does vary during the menstrual cycle. The problem was that without modern ways of tracking ovulation, the calculation was extremely uncertain. So you could have a method based on a real biological pattern but still get the prediction wrong. And then there were barriers. Ancient sources describe wool, lint, plant fibers, and other materials being used with medicinal mixtures. Some may have functioned partly as physical barriers, while others were intended to alter the environment around sperm. Egyptian medical texts provide some of the earliest surviving written evidence for these kinds of preparations. This is one of the more interesting things about ancient contraception. The technology was primitive. The problem was not. Humans had already figured out the basic challenge. Pregnancy begins with a microscopic event, so the best solution is to interfere before that event happens. They just had very limited tools for doing it. And outside the Mediterranean, traditions continued to develop in other parts of the ancient world. In South Asia, classical medical traditions included herbal preparations and discussions of fertility control. In other societies, people used plants, oils, amulets, ritual practices, and timing. Some methods were probably pharmacologically active. Some may have had a mechanical effect. Some were probably symbolic. And some were simply attempts to make an unpredictable situation feel controllable. That last part is easy to overlook. Imagine living thousands of years ago. You don't know about chromosomes. You don't know about sperm cells. You don't know exactly when ovulation happens. You don't have pregnancy tests. You don't have modern contraception. But you can observe something very obvious. Sex can lead to pregnancy, and pregnancy changes your entire life. So naturally, people experimented. They watched patterns. They remembered what happened to their bodies. They tested plants. They copied recipes. They passed down warnings. They invented rituals. They tried whatever seemed to make sense. And sometimes, they probably got lucky. This is why ancient contraception is less a story about stupid people using ridiculous ingredients and more a story about humans trying to solve a difficult biological problem with almost no information. Even the crocodile dung story tells us something. Whether that particular recipe was genuinely effective is uncertain. But the idea behind it was understandable. Create a substance that changes the environment and physically interferes with sperm. It wasn't modern science, but it was an attempt at biological engineering. Very, very low-budget biological engineering. And there's another method that doesn't get nearly as much attention, simply having fewer opportunities for pregnancy. Long breastfeeding, periods of abstinence, delayed marriage in some societies, and spacing births for social or economic reasons could all influence how often pregnancies occurred. Not every ancient society treated fertility the same way. And we shouldn't imagine one universal ancient experience. Some people wanted large families. Some wanted to delay the next pregnancy. Some desperately wanted children and struggled with infertility. Others may have wanted to avoid pregnancy altogether. The motivations were human. The tools were not. So, what actually worked? That's the frustrating answer. We don't know the exact effectiveness of most ancient methods. Mechanical barriers and withdrawal could reduce the chance of pregnancy, but were far less reliable than modern contraception. Some plant-based preparations may have had real biological effects, but evidence for their effectiveness is limited. Other recipes were likely ineffective or potentially dangerous. And this is where the modern world looks almost unbelievably different. Today, we can use methods specifically designed around the biology of reproduction. We understand sperm. We understand ovulation. We understand hormones. We can manufacture barriers to precise specifications and test them. Ancient humans had none of that. They were solving the same problem with scraps of knowledge, plants, minerals, animal products, observation, and tradition. Sometimes they found a reasonable idea. Sometimes they found a terrible one. Sometimes they probably found something that worked a little but had no idea why. And sometimes they were putting crocodile dung in the equation and hoping for the best. There is also an important lesson in what survives in the archaeological record. We mostly hear about contraception when somebody bothered to write it down. That means the evidence is automatically biased toward literate societies, trained healers, and unusual recipes. Ordinary people may have had everyday practices that left absolutely no trace. A woman could know that breastfeeding delayed her periods. A couple could practice withdrawal. Someone could avoid sex during a certain part of the month. A family could simply decide that another child was not possible right now. None of that necessarily becomes a famous papyrus. So when we say, ancient humans used this, we should sometimes really be saying, we have evidence that some ancient people knew about this. That distinction keeps the story honest. And there is one more fascinating detail. Ancient medical writers did not only write about preventing pregnancy, they also wrote about diagnosing it. Egyptian medical papyri contain descriptions of pregnancy tests involving urine and grains such as barley and emmer. The basic idea was to observe whether the plants grew after being watered with a woman's urine. Modern pregnancy tests obviously work very differently, but the instinct was the same. Find a biological signal. Turn it into an answer. Pregnant or not. That is a surprisingly modern way of thinking. It shows that ancient medicine was not just superstition floating around in the dark. It was a mixture of observation, tradition, symbolism, practical experimentation, and some genuinely clever guesses. Of course, the guesses could also go spectacularly wrong. And that's probably the biggest difference between ancient contraception and modern contraception. Today, if a method fails, we can investigate why. Ancient people often couldn't. They might blame timing. They might blame the particular plant. They might change the recipe. They might try a ritual. They might simply assume the method worked because pregnancy didn't happen that time. And that creates a problem called survivorship bias. If someone used a contraceptive recipe and didn't become pregnant, the recipe looked successful. If someone became pregnant, the failure could be explained away. Without reliable records, nobody could calculate an actual success rate. So, ancient contraception lived in a strange space between medicine and guesswork. But underneath all of it was a remarkably familiar human problem. People wanted choices. They wanted to decide when to have children. They wanted to recover between pregnancies. They wanted to protect their health, their resources, their relationships, or simply their plans for the future. The methods changed dramatically across thousands of years. The motivation didn't. Today, contraception can sound like a modern technology story. Pills, condoms, implants, IUDs, hormones. But zoom out far enough, and you see something much older. Humans have been trying to negotiate with reproduction for as long as we have written evidence of human medicine. The ancient world didn't give people reliable control over fertility, but it gave us the first surviving record of people trying. And honestly, that may be the most human part of the entire story. The methods changed dramatically across thousands of years. The motivation didn't.